Society and Anthropology here at IBIS. For anyone who's not in our community, IBIS stands for Institute of Brown for Environment and Society. We are a multidisciplinary environmental research center. We have scholars from the natural sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities, and a lot of very different perspectives, very different approaches, very different methods to thinking about and confronting all of the most urgent environmental challenges that we face in the 21st century. That's what IBIS is focused on. And as part of this, we are really excited to be thinking through and expanding our focus on environmental justice, which is one of the core reasons why we have started this, this speaker series. And I am really, really happy to have Mike Mendez here to kick off. Mike is our first external speaker. I kicked off the speaker series a couple weeks ago, but Mike is a good friend and brings a ton of perspective on environmental justice policymaking and movement building at multiple levels in California. And so we're so grateful to have you here, Mike, to share your perspective. Just so that folks know what a distinguished guest we have, I will read a formal bio and potentially embarrass Mike, but it bears reading. So Michael Mendez is an assistant professor of environmental policy and planning at the University of California, Irvine. He has more than a decade of senior level experience in environmental policymaking. As a scholar, he has contributed to state and national research policy initiatives, including serving as an advisor to a California Air Resources Board member and as a participant of the U.S. Global Change Research Program's workshop on climate vulnerability and social science perspectives. Most recently, Mike was appointed by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine to the Board on Environmental Change and Society, or BECS. He also serves as a panel reviewer for the National Academies of Sciences Transit Cooperative Research Program. And he holds not 2, but 3 degrees in environmental planning and policy, including a PhD from UC Berkeley's Department of City and Regional Planning and a graduate degree from MIT. His research on the intersection of climate change and communities of color has been featured in numerous national publications. And his new book, which you definitely should check out, Climate Change from the Streets, was just published through Yale University Press earlier this year. He'll be talking a lot about it today, and it's an urgent and timely story of the contentious politics of incorporating environmental justice into global climate change policy. So without further ado, I will kick it over to Mike, and thank you again for blessing us with your insights.
Great, thank you, Miles. It's such a pleasure to be here and have this forum to engage with you. I enjoyed our time together working on some of these issues when we were both at the Yale School of Environment. So thank you for this opportunity, and I also thank the Institute to be able to talk to various different scholars from different disciplines. I've known a couple of them, such as Tim Robbins, and then other scholars at nearby RISD, Damian White. So I enjoyed the opportunity to elaborate a little bit more about my book that looks at the intersection of environmental justice, climate change, and public health issues. So let me share my screen with you. Okay, great, thank you. So in California, we're really in this historic moment right now where we're experiencing a major climate crisis along with the national historic racial unrest going out throughout the country. But here in California, the last 2 months, millions of people have been impacted by multiple disasters, fires, blackouts, heat waves, drought, hazardous air quality, and of course the ever-present COVID-19 pandemic. These are all major compounding life events. Currently, 3 of the 10 largest wildfires by acreage in California's history are currently burning. These compounding of disasters have cascading health, social, economic impacts. Due to existing structural inequality, these impacts are disproportionately affecting low-income people of color. To address these issues of the climate emergency, activists and policymakers have proposed the Green New Deal, primarily at the federal level. As many of you know, it's a radical proposal to decarbonize our economy while addressing poverty and inequality. However, for the last 2 decades, low-income communities of color have also pushed state and local governments to experiment with reducing greenhouse gas emissions and approaches that also address inequality and public health. These efforts in climate experimentation have been contentious and often met with significant resistance. While I'm supportive of the Green New Deal, I'm here to also say that there's nothing new about the Green New Deal. Climate change experiments in places like California since 2006 have been all-out street fights. Environmental justice activists have often been pitted against traditional environmentalists who favor the least costly mitigation solutions, which do not necessarily maximize equity and public health outcomes in low-income communities of color. These conflicts over climate change are cultural at their core. They illustrate that although the science of climate change is clear, policy decisions about how to respond to its effects remain contentious. Even when such decisions claim to be guided by objective knowledge, they are made and implemented through political institutions and relationships, and all the competing power struggles and racial struggles that this implies. If we look towards the example of California, it reveals the contingent nature of climate policy, the assumptions and the social, political, and cultural attitudes that often create conflicts between community understandings of local environmental conditions and the prevailing global top-down conceptualization of climate change. In California, tensions between different approaches to addressing climate change are often centered on the politics of scale, economics, and race. These differences in worldviews, if unacknowledged, can lead to the breakdown of trust, even among groups that are nominally working towards the same goal, reducing the harm that climate change will do to human societies and our planet. For insight into national level conflicts between groups working on climate change solutions, one should look towards the nearly 2-decade California experiment of incorporating environmental justice and health equity principles into climate change policy. For environmental justice activists in California, the main threat from climate change is the disproportionate harm it causes to their bodies and the health of their community. For them, climate change is not just about global greenhouse gas models, rather it's also about opposing worldviews through which that policy and science is seen. Yet California is often seen as a homogeneous entity that uniformly values environmentalism and climate action. This image universalizes the idea of climate change and detaches it from its cultural settings. It also obscures the localization of environmental policy and science within the state and how it involves processes of public consultation and legitimacy. For instance, in this major book on California's environmental history that was published in 2018 by a major academic university press, there's only 2 references of people of color in the entire history of California's environmental policies. And this book really defines itself as a definitive environmental history of California. So this traditional environmental narrative of California often relates and creates this erasure of people of color and enacting comprehensive environmental policy. So therefore, I published my book, Climate Change from the Streets, with the explicit focus on people of color. My book foregrounds people, place, and power in the context of climate change and inequality because of its absence in the history of California's environmental and climate action. This research originated in my public policy work for California State Legislature during a 15-year period. This provided me valuable insight into how the interactions of governments, businesses, community-based organizations shape climate policy. My research is further influenced from my upbringing in a low-income Latino immigrant community of Los Angeles that faced multiple environmental threats. As a youth in places like Cocoima, I was surrounded by people resisting environmental racism. Whether protesting the siting of landfills or toxic sites, they were organizing to demand the cleanup of toxic properties. They also sought to understand how these situations originated, to develop alternatives, and to imagine new environmental futures. This has focused my work on the conceptualization of environmental justice and climate change and what it means to activists, policymakers, experts, and scientists. Understanding this is important because the idea of environmental justice has been growing in scope beyond its initial application to the inequitable distributions of hazardous waste dumps in poor communities of color. My work analyzes the expansion of environmental justice policy discourse and the ways in which it has challenged definitions of nature and society. When I began this research project in California, I was struck by the lack of scholarship on the narratives of environmental justice in the context of climate change. The literature shows a real neglect of environmental justice groups' worldview and influence in the climate change policy arena. The lack of a narrative perspective is largely due to the fact that since the 1980s, environmental justice studies have sought to legitimize itself as an area of serious academic inquiry. The first generation of environmental justice scholars in general focus on causality and quantifying environmental inequality through the lens of race and class at a single scale. However, an emerging second generation has extended the field to incorporate a deeper consideration of critical theory and intersectionality, the ways in which gender, class, sexuality, immigration status, and other categories of difference shape environmental justice struggles at multiple scales. This second generation has been dubbed critical environmental justice studies, and it focuses on 4 important questions that are central to my work. The first question asks, how does intersectionality, multiple forms of difference such as gender, sexuality, immigration status, influence environmental justice outcomes? And the second question is, to what extent should scholars focus on a single scale or multiple scale about the causes of environmental justice and the possible resolutions to environmental justice struggles? The third, to what degree do state power and market systems entrench social inequality? And the final question, how can marginalized groups whose participation is indispensable to society contribute to a more sustainable and collective future? Using this critical environmental justice lens, my key argument in the book is for society to successfully resolve the phenomenon of climate change. Critical attention must be placed on the human dimensions of climate policymaking, such as local knowledge, culture, and history, and this should be done at multiple scales. Central to this argument is a demonstration that environmental protection and improving public health are uniquely linked, and maintaining that link is key to advancing future climate action policies. The case of California is particularly productive as a case to analyze how the human dimensions of climate change policy are contested or legitimized. As the world's 5th largest economy and the only US state to implement a comprehensive program of regulatory and market-based mechanisms to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, California has consistently been at the forefront of broader national and global environmental experimentation. The state's cap and trade system, a central market-based mechanism for ensuring carbon emission reductions, is the 3rd largest in the world after the European Union and China. This program has been especially contentious in debates within California. Supporters emphasize its global reach and cost effectiveness, and detractors criticize its inequitable effects on specific local communities and demographic groups. California's prominence in climate change policy makes it an ideal place to investigate the dynamics of such disputes and their roots in differing climate change worldviews. My multi-sided ethnographic policy analysis weaves together an examination of 3 interconnected case studies. The first, climate and public health activism in 2 heavily impacted communities of color, Richmond and Oakland, California. Conflict over state-level carbon trading and use of its revenue and investment in local communities most harmed by air pollution. And then the third, international and global implications of forest conservation projects in the global south and Mexico and Brazil allowed under California's market-based climate change laws. These cases combine to reveal the contested politics of the local, state, and transnational levels on which California makes climate change policy and takes action. And more importantly, this research, ethnographic multi-sided research, follows activists, how they transverse between geographies and policy scales. And I did this for nearly 15 years. For example, activists in places like Richmond, California, which has the largest oil refinery west of the Mississippi. And that Chevron refinery also is the single largest greenhouse gas emitter in all of California. So activists, environmental justice activists in this area understand that they need to have local policies to address the inequities, but at the same time, there's larger structural issues at the state, regional, national, and global levels that is impacting this forms of environmental racism and inequality that are happening. So I follow these activists as they moved between their conflicts, their ideas between the local scale to the statewide scale in Sacramento, understanding that California is a global leader in climate change. Again, it's a cap and trade system. It's the third largest in the world. And California really sees itself as a nation state and has aspirations to be on the global platform more. So they work in Sacramento also to change that global nature of its cap and trade system, its climate change programs, to have a more local environmental justice focus. At the same time, they're also participating in global forums such as the United Nations Conference of the Party, where they're meeting with other environmental justice groups from around the world, as well as human rights and indigenous leaders, where they come together to oppose California's expansion of its cap and trade system to the global south and Chiapas, Mexico, and Acre, Brazil. And that's the case study I'll be speaking about in depth shortly. Therefore, I have three goals of my multi-scale research. The first is to demonstrate that public health and environmental justice perspectives can be central to successful climate change policy development and implementation. Second is to offer an interdisciplinary framework for theorizing the kinds of negotiations between scales and worldviews that are involved in the development of equitable climate change policy. And then finally, to provide a set of findings that activists can use to negotiate with governments that legitimizes their perspectives about the differential impacts of climate change on disadvantaged communities. So a quick note on my methods. As a multi-scalar case study, my work draws on two main sources: notes on my years observing policymaking in Sacramento State Capitol, and extensive interviews with climate policymakers, scientists, experts, business leaders, and environmental justice stakeholders from 2012 to 2015, with several follow-up interviews conducted in 2017 and 2018. My participant observer reflections, content analysis, and semi-structured interviews provide valuable information on the conflicts and collaborations defining climate change and environmental justice in California and beyond. So next, now I'm going to be talking about that case study in the Global South. So I want everyone to have an open mind about this. I know this is a very interdisciplinary institute, and some people are very wedded to market-based mechanisms, but I think it's important to understand the environmental justice perspective, why they oppose market-based mechanisms, and particularly carbon offsets in the Global South. So this case study is from my book. Here we will be jumping scales from the local to the global. We see how the conceptualization of environmental justice as an organizing theme has spread horizontally throughout California and is now vertically linked to the Global South and Mexico and Brazil. For California advocates, there has been a growing need to develop a global consciousness in the environmental justice movement. Activists recognize the importance of connecting local agendas with trends they see nationally and internationally around climate change. In this case study, I examined how continued collaboration, experimentation, protests, and coalition building since 2010 have brought California's environmental justice perspectives onto the global stage. Their story centers on the ways in which carbon markets can create international links between local injustices and prompt new forms of translocal activism. While many of you may not agree with this, again, this is a great opportunity to understand the logics and the methods in which environmental justice groups do this type of work. A central figure in this story is Mary Rose Taruk, an activist with the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, or APEN for short, one of the leading environmental justice groups in California, which is also based in Richmond, California, which has that Chevron refinery. Interesting, her last name is an indigenous last name in Tagalog, and it means to know. According to Mary Rose, the need to engage on a global scale became clear when APEN's Native American allies, who represent sovereign nations, were participating in United Nations debates on climate change policy. Native American advocacy groups like the Indigenous Environmental Network developed campaigns that brought US environmental justice groups to the United Nations and other global spaces. And these arenas, California environmental justice groups learned how linking their local campaigns could also help indigenous communities in the Global South. These interactions laid a strong foundation for when new translocal efforts were developed when California attempted to link its cap and trade system to Chiapas, Mexico, and Acre, Brazil through forest offset credits. Carbon offsets allow California polluting industries to pay someone else anywhere else in the world to reduce their emissions by engaging in such activities as forest conservation. Forest offsets are also known as reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, or RED. In other words, RED offsets allow polluters at home in California to pollute only if developing countries keep their forests in the ground and do not use their own natural resources. Polluting businesses in the United States are allowed to continue to pollute, and most often in low-income communities of color like Richmond and Oakland. California traditional environmentalists such as the Environmental Defense Fund and the Nature Conservancy, polluting businesses, and some large indigenous groups. These are indigenous groups that have formal land title and more political standing to negotiate with governments, support such offset projects because of cost effectiveness, ecological enhancements to tropical forests, and benefit sharing opportunities for indigenous communities. These groups stress the need to combat tropical deforestation, that is the cutting and burning of trees to convert land to grow crops, extract oil, or to raise livestock. It is estimated that such activities account for 20% of the Earth's human-caused carbon emissions. Polluting industries such as support forest offsets in the global south because it is a significantly cheaper option for reducing carbon emissions when compared to domestic mechanisms. For California environmental justice groups, however, it is seen that RED credits likely would not address local air pollution. They foresaw increased emissions in disadvantaged communities. Smaller indigenous groups in Atla and Chiapas, these again are smaller groups or forest people that don't have formal title to their land and less political standing to negotiate, argue that the new value of pristine forest reserves could motivate landowners to evict forest-based indigenous communities, especially in regions like Chiapas, where there's been a long history of violent conflict over land rights. To them, RED could exacerbate local environmental problems and perpetuate historic injustices. Thus, in response, a new trans-local coalition emerged between South and North social movements. Here again, we see how notions of environmental justice from California can travel and are horizontally and vertically linked. The Translocal Coalition, moreover, argues for a systems thinking or feedback loop approach in climate change policy. For example, they claim imports of crude oil from the Amazon are driving the destruction of some of the rainforest ecosystem's most pristine areas and releasing large amounts of greenhouse gases. According to an Amazon Watch study, American refineries processed over 230,000 barrels of Amazon crude oil, and California represents a large majority, an average of 171,000 barrels, comprising 74% of all Amazon crude imports into the United States. For Mary Rose, a hostile incident solidified her determination against RED and towards a systems thinking approach to climate change policy. At a 2010 United Nations meeting in Cancun, Mexico, she was detained and tossed out of the climate negotiations for holding a sign opposing carbon markets. Quote, "You would think I would be afraid after that experience, but actually I was encouraged because to the right of me at the protest was the president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, and to the left of me were leaders of social movements from the Western Hemisphere, from the MST of Brazil and the Via Campesina of Mexico, and in front of me were Native American brothers and sisters from the Indigenous Environmental Network who had been campaigning to end RED forest offsets," end quote. Working together in person and via conference calls during 2011 and 2012, California environmental justice groups and indigenous rights groups organized an opposition campaign. Through this process, they were able to overcome concerns from Mexico and Brazil that California environmental justice groups might sell them out through carbon market trading and revenue sharing programs and opportunities. After several collaborations and negotiations, they eventually forged a common understanding about the spatial implications and global reach of California's carbon market, highlighting potential harms to those living among the trees and those living next to polluting industries. This debate is so contentious because California is the third largest carbon market in the world. The implication here, California is a global climate leader, and if the state adopts RED, others will follow. While policymakers in California proclaim the benefits of forest offsets at international events, several indigenous groups from the global south protested the lack of consultation during the development of a proposal that could impact their lives and livelihoods. The first major protest against California's carbon market occurred on September 26, 2012, where over 40 indigenous protesters from the Lancome jungle and members of international NGOs gathered outside the governor's Climate and Forest Task Force meeting in Chiapas, Mexico. The task force was founded by the state of California, and it brought together government and business officials dedicated to implementing REDD policies globally. They represented 16 local governments of 6 countries: Mexico, Brazil, Indonesia, United States, Peru, and Nigeria, and between them held 20% of the world's forests. Among the most vocal protesters at the forest meeting was Ufima Sanchez, a Mayan indigenous leader from the remote jungles of Chiapas. Denied a chance to address the meeting, Sanchez seized the microphone during the open plenary and spoke before a packed auditorium of several hundred participants. Quote, "We have come before you today to denounce the programs and projects that threaten to dispossess us of our territories. Why do the wealthy want to impose their will by force? The jungles are sacred and they exist to serve the people. We don't come to your countries and tell you what to do with your lands and lives. We ask for the same respect," end quote. Ufima's rejection of office invoked the nature of the forest as a home, as a historically contested territory, and as a sacred space. Her intervention highlights how climate policy maps onto existing cultural meanings and social and historical dynamics concerning property and politics. For example, in this, one of the signs that's here in Spanish says, "The government of Chiapas is lying to us. They didn't inform us, they didn't consult us, and we don't want REDD in our country." This is important because under United Nations, to have such type of agreements, there has to be free and prior informed consent. And the allegation here is that free and prior informed consent did not occur between California and other members of the governor's forest task force. 3 weeks later, after the forest task force meeting, an international delegation of indigenous leaders from Mexico, Brazil, Ecuador, traveled to Sacramento, California to register their opposition in person at a California Air Resources Board meeting public hearing on October 18, 2012. The delegation was hosted by Friends of the Earth and several California environmental justice organizations. While digital technology communications aided the development of a South-North exchange, activists understood that physical sites of assembly were still the most effective way to collectively express resistance and challenge the dominant power. California represented the locus of power, as it is the only local jurisdiction in the world considering REDD offsets. The presence of indigenous leaders alongside California environmental justice advocates, moreover, showcased a narrative of the potential South-North environmental injustice derived from California's global market-based climate solutions. In other words, it was a symbolic reminder of the spatial and human scale impacts of carbon markets. For example, here, one of the activists from Chiapas, Mexico, a public health advocate working closely with indigenous tribes in Chiapas, Mexico, distributed copies of this brochure that the state of Chiapas gave to delegates at the 2010 Conference of the Parties for the United Nations. And here it shows that that anticipation of a California-linked carbon market with forest offsets, that they already at that time were displacing indigenous tribes in anticipation of having a globally linked forest offset program with California. There was also indigenous leaders from Ecuador, Brazil. For example, one of the, Ninowa, the president of the Federation of Unique People, was quoted as saying, "Indigenous people are feeling the effects of offset programs. They are restricting our way of life and our ability to have access to our traditional hunting, fishing, and gathering sites. So for this reason, we are urging you not to accept REDD offsets in your trading program." Environmental justice groups from California were also in strong opposition and had their own coalition there. They were quoted as saying, "We stand with our international brothers and sisters. We believe REDD programs are bad for our communities internationally that are being decimated from the program, and California communities that are not receiving the benefit from local pollution reduction." When the board hearing concluded, members of the Translocal Coalition continued their lobbying efforts at the state capitol. They met with legislative leaders and presented them with a letter signed by more than 30 California-based organizations opposing red. Following the Capitol Lobby Day, the coalition organized a No Red tour throughout Northern California. Coalition members sought to educate the public about the effects of offset programs of people living in both industrial and forest regions. The tour led to a larger policy discussion in the Capitol and news media over California's ability to monitor the integrity of international forest offsets in developing countries. For example, the legal scholar Alan Romo noted that any international offset program implemented in a developing country would depend upon the host country or third parties for validation. Corruption at any stage, including initial reporting, verification, and monitoring, could undermine offset programs. Romo's comments, influenced by the visibility of the Translocal Coalition, further raised concerns with Capitol staffers, legislative staffers that is. These included whether the state could monitor international forest offsets in the same manner as domestic ones. The state, unlike the federal government, lacks international authority to enforce provisions or intervene in another country's sovereignty. Several senior Capitol legislative staff members said that California should be cautious when developing linkages where doing so could induce or exacerbate human rights violations in the global south. And this increased with the recent fires that happened in Brazil, that we see that while California's forest offset protocols and problems have a surplus and some buffer zones, the unprecedented fires that we're seeing in California, Australia, and Brazil is happening at a higher rate than was previously projected. So there's arguments now in recent studies saying that there's not enough to protect these forests and that can maintain carbon emissions for 100 years because the increases in severity wildfire in places like California that are having year-round wildfire season, and also issues of corruption in places like Mexico. There was a great analysis from Los Angeles Times and ProPublica about drug cartels taking over forest conservation projects, not to grow drugs, but to grow avocados, because they have a higher rate now on the market than actually some drugs. And there's been also cases that these studies have shown that conservation scientists have been threatened with their lives if they are going to complain to the government or to other international leaders. At a red panel I hosted in 2016 at the Yale School of Forestry, the California Air Resources Board member Dean Flores commented that regulators are walking a fine line balancing in-state political pressures with a goal of combating global climate change. He was quoted as saying, "Are we trying to save California, or are we trying to save the world?" And in some sense, the answer may be both, end quote. Flores identified international forest offsets as one of the most controversial issues facing the board. He added that the Translocal Coalition has done a good job in highlighting the alleged negative aspects of offsets, which make it more difficult to quickly approve the program. Throughout 2012, California environmental justice groups and indigenous leaders demonstrated how powerful network coalitions could shape environmental narratives of carbon reductions. During the next 5 years, the Translocal Coalition helped stall momentum towards adoption of an international forest offset program. Most importantly, their protests created market and political uncertainty. Today, the issue continues to be contentious and unresolved in Sacramento. This form of translocal activism is consistent with Margaret Keck and Catherine Shashink's research on global human rights activism. What the authors term the boomerang pattern can be observed in the ways in which NGOs in the global South work with similar domestic groups in the global North. In the case of translocal opposition to RED, indigenous groups in Chiapas and Acre protested their own government, state A, to stop the development of offset programs. However, due to the relative weakness of civil society in Mexico and Brazil, meant that the groups lacked sufficient power to influence their governments and could even become targets of repression themselves, a situation diagrammed as the blockage in the pattern. The groups therefore connected with California organizations for help. The Global North organization's comparison had a greater degree of freedom of action and benefited from stronger civil societies. Information sharing and collaboration between regions led California environmental justice groups to protest their government, State B, to block the program. Therefore, under the boomerang model, California policymakers, perhaps not wanting to be viewed as adopting policies that could provoke human rights abuses abroad, began to slow down the process of approval of global offsets. Again, these issues have remained contentious and debated in Sacramento. Therefore, through their efforts, anti-red activists are challenging the worldviews that are considered valid within California's decision-making on climate change. The Translocal Coalition posed a fundamental question: who has the power to protect nature and humanity from the existential threat of climate change? The answer has emerged through various forms of conflict and collaboration. California's climate policy increasingly depends on the ways in which it incorporates marginalized voices from within the state and now around the globe. Some key findings from this case study on translocal activism and Red Coalition. The first is that dissident groups formed an anti-red campaign based on diverse worldviews and histories of climate change. Second, environmental injustice is interconnected. Environmental justice groups travel across geographies and scales to effectively address them, and there are spatial implications of carbon markets. The coalition challenged state power in the global north and the south, rejecting global structures that embedded environmental injustices within climate solutions. And finally, instead of market-based climate solutions, environmental justice groups have argued for more equitable alternatives that benefit California and those in the global south. However, there's some limitations and challenges through this translocal coalition building. The first is there's unequal power dynamics between global north and global south activists, as I mentioned, between civil societies and issues of repression. There's divergent perspectives and priorities among global South indigenous groups, US Native American tribes, and California environmental justice groups. As I briefly mentioned at the start of the case study, that there are indigenous groups in the global South that support carbon offsets in California's presence in their indigenous lands, but these are largely indigenous groups that have formal land title and more authority to negotiate on these issues. And finally, US Native American tribes, they're split on this. The Yurok tribe, which is the largest Native American tribe in California, is the largest offset developer in the United States that's linked to California, and they're in strong support, and they work with some of these larger indigenous groups in the global South. And then some California environmental justice groups are split on if they should not be working in the global South. Another issue is the state and market forces may co-opt this moment, greenwash red programs, red plus programs, and argue that they check the box, meeting with some of these groups, and they're doing all they can to provide safeguards, social equity safeguards. And then finally, red, this is the unresolved issue. And there's a lot of difficulty, time, and resources in sustaining these translocal coalitions over time. And this translocal coalition has been in existence for over 10 years, and it is quite a difficult task to maintain that. So what are the broader theoretical implications of this case study, and how is it related to the larger project of my book and my research agenda? Through my more than 10 years of research, I came to see a tension between different worldviews of climate change, those of scientists and mainstream environmental groups and policymakers, and those of environmental justice advocates. While the worldviews are not absolute, they are a generalization of the dynamics I initially observed within California from 2006 and 2012 primarily. In the first worldview, I generally saw one based on utilitarianism, efforts to develop climate policy for the greatest good for the greatest number. I call this worldview carbon reductionism, an adherence to cost effectiveness and market-based solutions focused only on reducing global greenhouse gas emissions without social equity and local health considerations for the most polluted communities. Under this worldview, my research generally observed governments being judged whether their policies are cost effective and benefit the majority. So if we look at the left-hand side of carbon reductionism, there's a strong emphasis on only greenhouse gas reduction potential, global greenhouse gas reduction potential. And this is often done and measured in tons of CO2 equivalent, because carbon is the most abundant greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. And there's this strong scientific framing around this issue, and very detached expertise of who can have contribute knowledge and both to the problem and the solutions, primarily scientists and other experts. And there's a strong emphasis on cost effectiveness. How can we reduce carbon emissions most cost effectively without having major shocks to our existing economic structures? And this is often done through market-based solutions such as cap and trade. I mentioned California has the third largest in the world. And this cap and trade system is linked to California and has aspirations to be globally linked throughout the world. So there's this strong geographic neutrality. So it doesn't matter where you reduce carbon emissions because it's a global emission. It doesn't affect local human health. It's not local pollution, it's a global pollution. So it doesn't matter where you reduce greenhouse gas emissions. You can do all your greenhouse gas emissions in Beverly Hills, or you can do it in Compton or South Los Angeles. It really doesn't matter as long as you reach that global target. And in initial years, before 2012, there was only a strong emphasis on mitigation, and California initially did not look at climate adaptation at all. So conversely, on the other side, environmental justice groups generally held a moral rights-based worldview. I dubbed their worldview as climate change from the streets, a critical reevaluation of both the practice and politics of reducing carbon emissions. Their worldview considers social equity and argues that a utilitarianism approach ignores distinctions between people and the disproportionate impacts of climate change has on low-income communities of color. My research observed the environmental justice worldview as more participatory, embodied, and experimental. So the right-hand side, there's an emphasis, of course, on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also on co-benefits potential. Also understanding that the majority of processes that creates greenhouse gas emissions, fossil fuel burning, also creates local pollution, such as NOx and SOx that does affect local health, but climate policy is often siloed from local pollution policy. So here they talk about marrying the two and having multi-benefit, co-benefit types of policy. So looking at co-pollutants, public health, and greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a strong contextual framing around climate change, understanding that climate change happens in larger society. There's other structural system, social, political, economic, that is linked to the inequalities that are happening in environmental justice communities. So there's a strong emphasis on local expertise and opening up the discourse and opportunities for communities of color to speak on the problematization of climate change and its solutions. So of course, there's an emphasis on cost effectiveness, but it should not happen at the expense of social equity. So looking together at climate change, incorporating environmental justice from the outset, not as an after the fact or check the box kind of issue. Within that, there's a strong emphasis on community-based solutions, making sure that people that live in these most impacted communities can also contribute. And there's an emphasis on social multi-scalar understanding, linking the local and global together. And then finally, environmental justice groups were one of the first in the state to really advocate that the impacts of wildfires, droughts, heat waves, extreme weather events are disproportionately impacting low-income communities of color, and that they should be at the forefront of climate adaptation policy. And it should also not only focus on hard assets such as infrastructure, hospitals, police stations, but also on local scale community, neighborhood climate adaptation projects. Many of you may consider these worldviews as a simple dichotomy. However, their use is intended to highlight a critical analysis of the contentious politics of scale, economics, and race. And it helps us as scholars to understand that the actors involved in climate policy making are often speaking from structural locations that are worlds apart. In 2010, yet I witnessed a big change in climate policy making. It became more participatory and synergetic. Through a recurring process of conflict and collaboration, a broad range of individuals and organizations are now co-producing what climate change means. Geographer Mike Hume argues that the tension between worldviews can have a balancing, even creative impact, yielding stronger, more robust approaches to resolving climate change. Furthermore, worldviews are not fixed, and they can transform over time. Scientific ideas and beliefs about climate change evolve together with the representations, identities, debates, and institutions that give practical effect and meaning to climate policies. In other words, the ways in which we conceptualize climate change don't just happen. People are behind our government policies and environmental values, and they can change their minds. For example, at a 2017 United Nations Climate Conference, the former California Republican Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger made statements that some traditional environmentalists ascribed now to the wrong climate worldview. He insisted that climate action should now focus more on local air pollutants and their health effects. Schwarzenegger's 2017 position, however, directly contrasted with his worldview when he held public office. As California governor, he often impeded efforts to link climate policy with environmental justice and public health. His changing perspective reflects the broader evolution of California's civic epistemologies of climate change. Through such instances, we can assess the diversification of climate change in politics, tracing how scientific facts about the world are fused with social commitments. I attribute this co-productionist framework as being underscored by the narrative of embodiment. Environmental justice groups were pushing new hypotheses as well as evaluating existing ones around climate problems and solutions. They are calling for multiple ways of learning and knowing about climate change. Through my many years of interviews and participant observations, I saw how environmental justice groups centered their work on telling stories of how their bodies bear the marks of environmental interactions. They framed their work on the human embodiment of climate change and carbon's associated co-pollutants. For them, the body is where diverse points of pollution, social stratification, and poverty intersect. I call this way of knowing and learning as climate embodiment, a concept that draws on ecofeminist theory and the field of public health. For example, environmental justice advocates in Richmond, which has the largest oil refinery, the Chevron refinery in California, argue that a holistic understanding the links between the infrastructural body, that is the extraction of raw materials for the construction of buildings, or the refining of oil, to the contaminated human body. So pollution from the infrastructural body to the contamination to the human body. In other words, we began to imagine a form of climate embodiment that represents a continuum, where the human body cannot be divorced from its environment and environmental solutions cannot be isolated from the human body. So in conclusion, this embodied research represents new models of engagement with climate change that make space for alternative paradigms of environmental protection. My engagement with key stakeholders since 2002 has allowed me to critically analyze how the success of climate change policy in California now depends on incorporating marginalized voices and embodied perspectives from local and global spaces. Thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you, Mike. That was a great talk. I sure learned a lot, and I know many of us in our community probably got a ton from your talk as well. Let's see. How shall we do questions in the chat? I don't have the power to unmute people, so if any of our administrators can help us figure this out.
If folks can raise their hands, use the raise hand feature, then I'll be able to see if anybody has a question.
Great, thank you, Vanessa. And while people are thinking about their questions, I'll just start with a question. So I really appreciated the idea of how worldviews evolve, and much of this research, I think you said, was focused really on 2006 to 2012. And I'm curious, in 2020, with understanding that you're not necessarily doing the deep ethnographic research this moment that you were doing over the past decade, what's your sense of how both legislators in Sacramento and also the big environmental NGOs, what are their takes on RED and on co-benefits, and how have their views changed or not?
That's a great question. So this is still a contentious issue. The last major public hearing and protest on RED happened last November or October, I can't remember, where they passed a protocol not to adopt it, but a framework of if California was to accept these, what are sort of the forms of verification, quantification, and monitoring that would be needed for the area. So this was very contentious, even just to create a protocol about how to analyze that. And it's really uncertain what's going to happen later on. I think a year ago, before all these unprecedented fires, I would have said it's a toss-up. If countries around the world, in Mexico and Brazil, implement on their own voluntarily a California protocol, then in about 3 to 4 years of data gathering, that California may have actually adopted a globally linked carbon offsets. But now with the fires in Brazil, the president that they have, fires in Australia, and the fires that are happening in California, there's been some great research out of UC Berkeley from some of the forest scientists there at the College of Natural Resources that is talking about just looking at California's wildfires. We have carbon offsets that we allow for domestic forest offsets. And as I mentioned briefly in the presentation, there's a buffer, there's a surplus. So the Air Resources Board anticipated that there would be fires, and some of these trees that were being sequestering carbon would be burned or wildfires, but there was a buffer and a surplus that could make up for that. But now the projections that are happening in California with a nearly year-round fire season, the analysis says that surplus may not be even sufficient for that. And it's questioning, even at a domestic level, should we be doing that? So if that surplus is being exhausted, that makes some of the credits illusionary. So people living next to a Chevron refinery or the refineries closer to me in Long Beach and Wilmington, California, they're not seeing the direct benefit of pollution reduction on site. So a key reason why environmental justice groups are opposed to that, because they argue that polluters like Chevron and other major gross polluters can buy their way out of adopting new technology and reducing emissions of GHG. And of course, what they care most, they also care equally about is co-pollutants that affects local pollution and local health. So now with these year-round fires, and as I mentioned, 3 of the largest fires in California's history are currently burning right now. And my new line of research now is looking at climate adaptation, particularly looking at migrant communities here in California and the impacts of compounding disasters such as wildfire. And I have a case study from one of the leading geography journals, GeoForum, The Invisible Victims of Disaster, Understanding the Vulnerability of Undocumented Latino and Indigenous Migrants. That case study was based on a 2017 case study of the Thomas Fire in Santa Barbara and Ventura counties. And that was, at the time, was considered, it was considered the second largest wildfire in California's history. And until August, it was the second largest wildfire. And now these wildfires that are happening in California has pushed Thomas Fire to being the 6th largest wildfire in history. And just about 2 months ago, it was the 2nd largest fire. So I would say that I think it puts more pressure on the Air Resources Board to do more due diligence. And I think there'll be a more contentious debate in the future years if this is formally presented to the board for adoption to link to the Global South.
Great, thank you. I know I have a ton more questions. Does anybody else want to chime in? Because if not, I will happily take up our last few minutes with some other thoughts.
If anyone...
Oh, there's a hand from Emily and Rachel.
Hi, I figured I'd turn on my camera to ask my question. I'm actually coming to you from Berkeley and Siena College of Natural Resources specifically. So this might be a loaded question, but I wanted to ask, in a politically polarized society in the US where it feels as though worldviews become very fixed, how can we as activists most effectively uplift narratives of climate embodiment to drive climate action?
Great question. And worldviews, we see our political culture, understanding climate change happens in large societies. So these worldviews are linked to other types of socioeconomic ideas and structures as well that don't want to see these environmental protection paradigms, because it has sort of a domino effect. But in California, again, people homogenize what happened in California. We're one of the largest agricultural leaders. As I mentioned before, my second line of research now is looking at migrant farm worker communities and climate adaptation. And the agriculture industry is a very big force in California. A lot of resources and a lot of clout in Sacramento and the state capital. So oftentimes these initiatives that from 2006 through 2012, and my book does end in 2019, but they were, as I mentioned, they were all out street fights. But it takes constant political pressure and coalition building to do this. And I think the biggest thing that happened over these almost 20 years of climate activism and a protest is this unique inside-outside game. That environmental justice groups were not only always protesting or suing the state of California to block these programs, but they also changed their worldviews and understand the need not only to have allies, but for them to become the experts within government themselves or other more traditional NGOs. And so we see environmental justice groups, people of color from these social justice groups being in the governor's office, being appointed to very important influential environmental boards, such as the California Air Resources Board, the California Public Utilities Commission, the Energy Commission, and so forth. So that's one strategy. Another strategy is how these environmental justice groups that were working in conservative rural areas, as I meant, the San Joaquin Valley, the Central Valley, strong agricultural, very pro-business. You can't really say the word climate change there in those places, which contrary to what people think of California, and it's just basing it on outcomes. How can we link these sustainability solutions, if you don't want to call it climate change, to jobs, to public health? Public health is one of the key most influential framing to convince people about having more broader sustainability problems and adopting more broader sustainability frameworks. So there's been great research that shows public health framing does that. So that's why the subtitle of my book is How Conflict and Collaboration Strengthen the Environmental Justice Movement, because it's a progression. It's an evolution of thinking, not just of policymakers or business leaders or conservative interest groups in the Central Valley, but also environmental justice groups themselves. They're not homogenous at all. You know, California is the 5th largest economy, has over 40 million people. So, and our geographies are very different. So oftentimes environmental justice groups don't always agree either. So it's a constant evolution. But again, the inside outside strategy, and then of course, again, connecting it to solutions, making climate change real, showing how jobs and public health will be improved in these areas that are not necessarily at the forefront of supporting climate change.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mike. If you don't mind, we can just go to one last question. Rachel has a question, and we can spend just a few minutes going over because I think we really value your insights. All you, Rachel.
Great. Thank you, Mike, so much. This is a great talk, and there's just so much here to unpack. But yeah, one thing I wanted to sort of hear more about that was really fascinating and inspiring was about this sort of global network of activists, right? So I wanted to hear you talk a little bit more about, you know, what are some of the challenges they face to maintaining this network across countries, and, you know, what are some of the strategies that they use to overcome those barriers?
Again, thank you, Rachel, for that question. And thank you for the previous question. I believe it was from Emily. As I mentioned in the case study, it was a long process. And, you know, the Indigenous Environmental Network, Friends of the Forest, and a couple other NGOs that had been working at the United Nations from 2008 to around 2010, they started more actively to recruit environmental justice groups from throughout the United States and targeted to California. And slowly, environmental justice groups, APEN, such as Mary Rose and a couple others, started to attend these and build interpersonal relationships, face-to-face relationships, which is quite important. But I think the biggest challenge is that California also is a leader. There's a lot of fighting around its cap and trade system. The environmental justice groups are strongly opposed. But some environmental justice groups, after it passed and they lost their lawsuits, were more pragmatic and passed legislation after 2 vetoes that siphons now over 35% of the billions of dollars that's coming in through the cap and trade system to local communities. So that's another major case study in my book. So in the last couple of years, $2 billion have been funneled back into environmental justice communities through that cap and trade system. So this revenue sharing opportunity. So indigenous leaders from Mexico and Brazil and throughout heard about this and were really put off by it and scared about that, because the Red Plus programs offer revenue sharing programs. So they thought California environmental justice groups were going to do a similar deal, because the cap and trade revenue is separate from carbon trading, carbon offsets. So they're 2 very different pots. And it took a lot of, according to my interviews and conversations with environmental justice groups, it took a lot of efforts for them to talk about the complexity of California's cap and trade system and its other regulatory mechanisms around climate change, to really show them that they weren't going to sell them out in a backroom deal, and really showing what were the commonalities of what's happening to people living among the trees and those living next to polluting industrial sites. So that was another key: video conferencing, telecommunications, and then grants that they were able to bring some of the key leaders before these California Air Resources Board meetings to Oakland, California, and Sacramento, to have strategy meetings together where they can actually talk face to face, like they did where they were doing in the United Nations. They also did that in Northern California before some of these major protests. So those were some of the issues, and really showing that a strong solidarity, and that continues today.
Great, thanks, Mike. Thank you so much for sharing your work and your insights. I think I will speak on behalf of the entire IBIS community and say this is really, really insightful, and also just very helpful for us to start to grapple more with environmental justice. Thank you to all of you who have spent the last hour on your Friday on Zoom with us. Hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. And please join us in a couple weeks when we have Rhode Island, Providence, EJ activist Monica Huertas to come to share her work from the activist perspective. And hope you all have a great weekend. And also check out Mike's book, Climate Change from the Streets. I've only read a little bit of it because it got stuck in my office due to COVID, but from what I read, it's quite good. So please check that out as well. Take care, have a great weekend, and see many of you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.